Modern architecture gets a lot of hate. But why do people hate it so much?
They want us depressed, sad, gray.
The architecture of modern cities is extremely ugly.
Have you noticed that every new building is ugly?
There's no good or bad architecture, just like there's no good or bad art. It's all subjective bullshit.
I'm in Washington, D.C., where we have a lot of government buildings that look like this and people don't like.
I'm Brian McKinney, and I'm a candidate for the United States Senate in West Virginia. It looks like it's right out of Soviet Russia. And what's funny is if we look at some of the other beautiful buildings, for example, the archives, it's beautiful compared to a government bureaucracy building that literally looks like it's downtown Moscow.
Do you like this building?
No, I don't. I don't think anybody would.
Do you like this building?
I like it. I know it's brutalist and kind of old, but I like it.
Why do you like it? How does it make you feel?
It makes me feel like, I don't know, the government is very drab and sincere.
It's honest.
Yeah. Right? It doesn't pretend to be anything other than like a good functional office building.
Why do you think architecture like this gets such a bad rap?
I think people just see it as like being plain. There's no windows. It's next to a really cool Smithsonian building. So when you compare the two, it feels a lot more boring. But I don't know, in some ways I think that could also make it cool. It's not trying too hard.
Do you guys like this building?
No. I'm gonna say yes. It just gives dystopia to me. Like, it just doesn't feel authentic.
After all this, I had to speak with an architect and ask them, what do you think about all these people dissing modern architecture?
I'm Nick Potts. I'm an architect based here in Washington, D.C., and we're outside one of my favorite brutalist buildings. This style of building it's not very popular by the public, and tides are changing. Essentially, any building in its first 50 years goes out of style. The same thing with Victorian buildings that were hated in the beginning of the 20th century.
The Victorian, in comparison, became an antiquated symbol of excess, whose architectural style was described as grotesque, and the mansions were called mongrel types, desecrating the landscape.
Architecture is like anything else. It goes through trends. What is cool becomes cringe, like bucket hats, pattern leggings, or the ice bucket challenge. A big reason people hate modern architecture is because how it compares to classical architecture.
This is something I've never gotten over or gotten a straight answer to. Why is it that the greatest buildings, indisputably, were built before electricity?
The ones with white marble, Roman columns, and naked children. So why can't we build buildings like that anymore?
The reason that we can't build a great neoclassical building, to have stone carvers, to have people bringing heavy materials and crafting them into shape on the job site, the labor on that would be so outrageously expensive that you cannot build the Capitol. You couldn't build the Library of Congress the way you build it now because, frankly, we treat our workers better.
I was pretty pissed off to learn that workers in the past weren't treated very nice. But even if we don't have serfs or Irish people, we have cars, computers, Celsius Vibe. So some people think that it's not about cost, but ideology.
A majority of the population have been lied to that there is a logical reason why the modern world is ugly. It's because of construction costs. Of course, everyone wants to know the cost, but the answer is 0% to 100% depending on your ambition level. But you can build for every target audience. And we have examples from that, especially from Berlin and Paris area. If you think about it, think about 150 years ago or turn of the century, 1900s. Everything was beautiful. And developers were as greedy as they are today. They were probably even more greedy, and there were less regulations on capitalism. Yet they built amazing architecture and cities then that we still cannot replicate.
My name is Jack Jiggens, co-founder of multiple businesses in property and construction.
What are your thoughts on why buildings from previous eras seem like they were constructed with more quality and lasting power?
If you look at all the buildings in central London, to build them nowadays, it would never get done. If you're building a steel frame with padded walls and then you finish it internally, your cost per square metre or square foot is going to be significantly lower than if you're building all these traditional buildings. I think one of the reasons that buildings are built stronger to last is because they didn't have the knowledge of actually the engineering behind it, so they over-engineered. So we know that if you put down 10 by 2 timbers across a building, what weight load that could be, because we could put it through particular testing and particular rules of thumb that may be reliant on physics, maths, science, experience, test casing it. Whereas they would just go, you just do it stone, because then you know that when Henry VIII finishes his lunch and falls off his chair, he's not going to go through the floor.
Is there a value that people are willing to pay for beauty?
Yes, in the right areas. No, in the wrong areas. So let's say you've bought a building plot or even a building, and everything around you has what we call a ceiling value. You're wasting your time adding beauty to that property, because at the end of the day, you can only see other buildings from inside your building. Yes, you get to drive up to it and look at it and admire it. But at the end of the day, when you walk through that front door, you're looking at everything else around you. So the viewpoint is really important. We have a development in North London. It's called Colney Hatch Lane. If you check out our Instagram pages, it's like our sexiest scheme, we call it. And we only build sexy schemes if the numbers work.
We've gotten really good at making buildings as cheap as possible without them falling down like a giant Jenga tower. So what we get is a bunch of boring gray boxes. And it's these buildings that people usually mean when they say they hate modern architecture. But do we also hate the Louvre, the Sydney Opera House, Pharrell's house, which looks like a really expensive community college? And maybe these buildings aren't as grand as Versailles, the Taj Mahal, and Big Ben. But what are we willing to pay for that? We can still make buildings that kind of look like that, but they end up looking like Disneyland. There's also some survivor bias when we compare modern to traditional architecture, because all the old buildings we see today have survived. We don't see the ones from hundreds of years ago that sucked and were torn down. We only see the good ones. And there's a long history of people spending a very questionable amount of money on buildings. Neuschwanstein, the German king, spent so much money that people called him crazy. He was kicked off the throne and died in a lake under mysterious circumstances. You have Versailles, which the French king spent so much money on this palace that French peasants broke in and cut his head off. You even have the Parthenon, going all the way back to ancient Greece. The Greek ruler at the time said, look guys, we need a sick palace. And he got roasted for that, because he spent over 50% of Athens' money to build the Parthenon. And at the same time, Sparta was doing push-ups and throwing babies off cliffs. And it made Athens very nervous. And they had no money for the military because they spent it all on the Parthenon. It got so bad that the Greek ruler suggested they take the gold from the Parthenon to fund an army. Didn't work out. Sparta came in, invaded, and turned the Parthenon into a military camp. That probably looked very stupid at the time. But 2,000 years later, we still have sunburnt, sweaty tourists climbing up the hill of the Acropolis to look at the Parthenon and ask, why can't we make buildings like that anymore?